10 longest prison sentences served by innocent people. Can you imagine spending years in prison for a crime you didn't commit? Hell, most people complain about spending an hour in a holding cell when they're guilty. Here are the 10 longest prison sentences served by innocent people. 10. James Richardson, 21 years. Back in 1967, James Richardson was convicted of killing 7 of his own children. He was initially arrested for poisoning his children and causing their deaths. The prosecutor indicted him for murder, and the jury convicted him and sentenced him to a life in prison. He spent 21 long years in prison. All that time, he was looked at as a man who had killed his own children. Finally, an appeal was filed by Richardson's attorney, Ellis Rubin, and special prosecutor Janet Reno in 1988. They argued that Richardson hadn't received a fair trial. James Richardson was a black man, and the entire jury that convicted him was white. It was found during his appeal that Richardson had not in fact hurt his children. He was finally released from prison and returned to his hometown of Arcadia, Florida at the ripe old age of 77. If you think that was bad, wait till you hear how bad the jury got it wrong in this next case. 9. Darrell Burton, 24 years. Any case where the only witness is a police informant could end up in an innocent man being committed. In 1983, a man named Donald Moe Ball had been shot in the arm by a rival gang member named Jesse Watson. Just a few months later, Ball was gunned down while filling his green Oldsmobile 98 at an Amoco station at the corner of Delmar and Goodfellow. Ball had died. About a month later, a prison snitch and a police informant fingered Darrell Burton for the crime. Burton was a very dark-skinned, 5'10" male. In fact, he was so dark-skinned that his playground nickname had been Lights Out. The only eyewitnesses to the crime said the man who shot Ball was a very short, light-skinned black man, standing about 5'5". At the time, Burton was a parolee who had spent 2 years in the local county jail for armed robbery. He had never been accused of a crime as serious as murder, though. He was arrested and charged with the crime against Ball. He sat in jail from 1984 until 2008, when new evidence finally cleared Burton of the crime and he was released. Thankfully, DNA evidence was able to clear an innocent man of charges after spending 25 years in prison. Take a look at this next story. 8. Stephen Phillips. Stephen Phillips was convicted of rape in 1983. He was given a life sentence and sat in jail for a quarter of a century. At the time Phillips was arrested, people had complained that the police had the wrong guy. But once the police set their sights on Phillips, they stopped looking for other suspects. After being convicted, the Innocence Project took on Phillips' case and were determined to get him justice. They relied on DNA evidence that was available and ignored at the time of Phillips' conviction. There was actually proof that the police hid evidence that would have proven that the crimes were committed by a man named Sidney Alvin Goodyear. Goodyear was eventually charged and convicted of the crime based on the suppressed evidence. At the time he was finally released in 2008, Phillips had been the first innocent man to spend 25 years in prison. When the DNA evidence cleared him of the crime in 2008, he was released from prison. He sued the state and was awarded $4.1 million. If you ever get charged with a crime, make sure it's not in Dallas County. This next man became the 15th innocent man to have been sentenced to life in prison in Dallas County. Check it out here.
Number 7.
Charles Chapman. Charles Chapman was just 20 years old when he was charged with raping a white woman in Dallas County. In January of 1981, a 52-year-old white woman reported that an African American had broken into her apartment. The man was wearing a dark cap over his head. He forced the woman to undress and proceeded to rape her. Before he left, he tied her up with scarves and made her lie face down on the floor. The man stole $15 in cash and a few other items from her apartment. Apparently, the perpetrator made several flights in and out of the apartment, carrying stuff out to his car. The woman described her attacker as a black man with facial hair. She said he was about 5'7" tall, but she wasn't wearing her glasses at the time of the attack, but claimed she remembered what the guy looked like. She never mentioned anything about the attacker having no teeth. Charles Chapman has no teeth. He had lost them in a football accident when he was younger. The victim identified Chapman in a lineup, and he was charged with the crime. When they tested the semen found on the victim's bed, all they could say for sure was that it matched about 40% of all black men. Despite the fact that Chapman met his attorney a total of 1 time before trial, and there was proof that he was at work at at the time of the crime, he was reported and sentenced to 99 years in prison. In January of 2008, DNA testing proved that Chapman had not committed the rape. He was finally released from prison after missing out on almost 30 years. This next guy missed out on a professional career in baseball due to a false conviction. Check it out next. 6. William Dillon. In August of 1981, a man named James Dorak was beaten to death in Florida. Right after the beating, a man picked up a hitchhiker who was wearing a yellow t-shirt covered in blood. The driver agreed to take the hitchhiker to a bar 3 miles down the road. The driver was partially blind and didn't get a good look at the man. Before he dropped him off, the driver performed oral sex on the guy. During the act, the hitchhiker took off the t-shirt and left it in the guy's car. After dropping him off, the driver threw the t-shirt in the local dumpster. When he heard about the crime the next day, he called the cops and told them about the hitchhiker. He also took them to the trash can and gave them the bloody t-shirt. 5 days later, the cops interviewed baseball prospect William Dillon. They said they thought it was suspicious that he knew about the crime, despite the fact that everyone knew about the crime by that point. He was arrested for the crime and charged with murder. The only witnesses were the blind driver and a dog handler who said his tracking dog connected Dillon to the crime. 27 years later, DNA evidence proved that Dillon had nothing to do with the crime. He was released from prison thanks to the help of the Innocence Project. It seems like 1983 was a bad year for innocent people. Here is another guy who was convicted.
Larry Griffin. 19-year-old Quintin Moss was shot 13 times in a drive-by shooting in Missouri in 1980. Career criminal and witness to the crime Robert Fitzgerald claimed that 3 black men were in the car, including Larry Griffin, who allegedly fired the lethal shot with his right hand. The fingerprints of Griffin, who was left-handed, weren't found in the car or on the murder weapon, and yet the court found him guilty of murder. In 1995, Griffin was executed by lethal injection, and to this day the St. Louis court refuses to withdraw his conviction. Number 4. Timothy Evans. In 1950, Beryl Evans and her baby daughter were murdered and their bodies were hidden in the wash house of their back garden. Beryl's husband, Timothy, was arrested and accused of murder despite a complete lack of evidence. Timothy was sentenced to death by hanging after just a 3-day trial. 3 years after his execution, Evans's neighbor, John Christie, was exposed as a serial killer. Christie confessed not only to the murder of Beryl Evans and her baby, but also to the murders of 6 other women in the house. They included his own wife, who he hid under the floorboards. Number 3. Joe Arady. Joe Arady was a 23-year-old man with severe learning difficulties. In 1939, he was arrested after being found loitering near the murder scene of a schoolgirl in Colorado. Although a man called Frank Aguilar confessed to the murder, the police coerced Arady into a confession too, and he was sentenced to death by electric chair. With an IQ of just 46, Arady had little understanding of his impending fate on death row, and spent his final days happily playing with a toy train. It wasn't until 72 years after his execution that he was proven innocent. Number 2. Aisha Ibrahim Dahulo. 13-year-old Aisha Dahulo was walking to her grandmother's house in 2008 when she was raped by 3 armed men. Her aunt took her to the police station to report the crime to Al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization that controlled their city in Somalia. No investigation was made into finding the rapists, and instead Aisha was arrested for committing adultery. As a crowd of 1,000 people gathered, a hole was dug in the ground, and Aisha was buried up to her neck and stoned to death. Number 1. The Griffin Brothers. In 1913, John Lewis, a 73-year-old white man from South Carolina, was found shot dead in his home. The murder weapon was traced to Monk Stevenson, but police offered him a life sentence in exchange for testifying against Thomas and Meeks Griffin. They were the 2 wealthiest black men in the county, who owned over 130 acres of land. An all-white jury and a racist judge who disapproved of black people owning land sentenced them to death by electric chair, despite having no hard evidence against them. It was not until almost 100 years later that historians confirmed the Griffins were innocent.